City this morning. I personally am glad our simian ancestors did not do that. And I hope that we will have the intelligence to stop doing similar things now, because we need to evolve further if we are to be in a position to face the dangers that I spoke of right at the beginning. If we are to be in a position to make ourselves more disease resistant, more resilient, more intelligent, with better science and technology, so that come the day, 3 billion years hence, when our Earth becomes uninhabitable, or come the day much sooner than that, when we are threatened with other forms of extinction, whether they're in the form of climate change or any other form, we will have the ability to try to rescue ourselves from those circumstances. Now, I don't regard this as a carte blanche, a license for science to do what it pleases. The regulation of science is vital, because one thing, it preserves public confidence, and for another, there are some pretty crazy people out there. So we need some regulation, and we need some prudence. But the problem with a precautionary approach to science is that I would suggest to you that risk, and I'm ending very shortly.
No, that's fine.
Risk is the hallmark of what might be called knowledge-intensive societies. Societies like yours and societies like mine. Universities like yours and universities like mine. Nothing is perfectly safe. It is our responsibility, not only as scientists and intellectuals, but as responsible citizens and, I was going to say human beings, persons is a term that I prefer. It's our responsibility to take risks in our own interests, in the public interests. We need to be confident that things are safe enough, and of course what safe enough means is relative to the goal and the dangers that we can foresee. We sometimes get these things wrong, of course we will, and we'll go on doing that. But not doing nothing is not an option. Because doing nothing allows things to go on happening, global warming to go on happening, diseases to go unchecked, and so on. We can't do nothing. We have to try to combat the dangers that face us. And in order to do that, we have to constantly make decisions about what is safe enough. Now, I think the reaction I don't think human reproductive cloning is an important objective at the moment. I'm not mad keen to see the creation biologically of a human clone. Although I hope I've said enough to convince you that we shouldn't be frightened when such a thing is safe enough to do and when people want to do it. We shouldn't be frightened of that because we're already familiar with clones, we're already familiar with people with identical genomes walking about the place. This is not a horror story. This is a ghost to frighten children. And the fact that we've allowed ourselves to be frightened by this is shaming on our species. So we shouldn't be frightened of it. If there are good reasons for doing it, we should be open to those reasons. At the moment, I don't think there are, but I think in the near future, deliberate human reproductive cloning will become safe enough to use, and then of course people will want to use it for all sorts of purposes. And we will have to consider what we do about that. But what I hope I've been convincing on is not necessarily whether or not we should approve of human reproductive cloning, but that we should be much more open to things that make us uncomfortable than we normally are. We need to be for our own preservation. It's in our interests to think of not only the importance of an open future for human individuals, but an open future for ourselves as a species which I hope is continuing to evolve, despite some rather grim views about the end of evolution by some scientists. I think they're wrong. There are all sorts of reasons to believe that we're still evolving, and moreover that we can accelerate that process deliberately by the choices that we make. So I hope we will be more prudent about what we rush to protest against. Cloning should not frighten us. Whether it should is something that we have to determine. Whether cloning or anything else is something that should frighten us is something that we have to decide about. There's a lovely remark by Mrs. Patrick Campbell, who was, those of you know, of George Bernard Shaw, an Irish playwright, very famous. Mrs. Patrick Campbell was allegedly his mistress, and she was told at a dinner party one night about two friends of theirs who were homosexual men and were having a homosexual relationship, and what she thought of it, asked to comment on what she thought of that. And she said, and she replied, well, I don't mind what they do, as long as they don't do it in the street and frighten the horses. So, of course, I'm talking about the 1890s, I think. We have to bear in mind what might frighten the horses, but we also have to think about whether or not it's sometimes worth frightening the horses in order, in the case of homosexual relations, to be tolerant and respectful of other human beings, and in the case of advances of science, so that we do not foreclose options that might save our lives and make them better. Thank you very much.
Preguntas, comentarios. Si alguien quiere hacer la pregunta en español, se lo podemos traducir al Dr. Harris. Gustavo.
Well, let's assume that cloning is allowed, and that we get better people, more intelligent, healthier, etc. But I wonder whether in our current economic and social conditions, that's not gonna, well, we can ask, who's gonna get this? Yeah. It's probably gonna be wealthy people. Yeah. So I wonder whether this is not gonna create more inequalities between the people who can afford to get this, to clone themselves and produce these better people, and people who cannot afford it. Yeah. So that's going to create that, you know, a bigger gap.
Well, the answer is yes. There are absolutely those dangers, and they're very difficult to combat. I think what I would say about that is that those dangers are the product of everything we do. They are the product of the, I don't know how education is funded in this country, but I'm sure that students in this university gain a lot of unfair advantages by being at such an excellent university over, firstly, those citizens who don't get to go to university at all, and those citizens who go to less good universities, which give them less good opportunities. Should we close down universities because they generate those sorts of equalities? I don't think so. What I think we have to do about I'm not blasé. I don't think inequalities are trivial. I think they're immensely important. And you have a tremendous history in this country. I've just been looking at the wonderful Diego Rivera murals in your Ministry of Education, I think it was. And they remind us about the horrors of inequality and exploitation constantly. And you have very good examples of reminders of those horrors in this society, as we do as well. We have to combat inequalities in another way. We can't say, take another example, take organ donation. I don't know what the situation is in Mexico, but in my country, 3 people a day die because there is a shortage of donor organs, 3 people a day. We have to make good that shortage. Now, of course, that creates all sorts of inequalities. Because what could be a greater inequality than failing to live when other people are living? That's really unfair and unequal. But it's seems to me the right approach is not to say we won't do any more transplants until we can provide them for everybody. We have to try to provide organs not on an ability to pay basis, but on a medical emergency or medical need basis. And we can do that with all sorts of resources, if we have the resolution and the right sort of government who's willing to do that, the right sort of national government I'm talking about now. So I think that's sort of, it's phrasing as dog in the manger, that you won't let other people enjoy good things until you can enjoy them yourself. I think that's the wrong approach. We need to go on creating, globally people have benefited, for example, from smallpox vaccine. Smallpox was killing millions, I think it was 300 million a year at its height. It's now been wiped out for everybody. But when it was developed, actually vaccines, as you will know, were developed in the 18th century. And rich people benefited from them first. And indeed, rich people actually tested them on themselves because they wanted the benefits. Quite interesting. We learned quite a lot from cowpox being used as a prophylactic. Of course, things are going to start where they're produced, and they're likely to be produced in knowledge-intensive societies like yours and mine. But it's our responsibility as the people who work in universities who produce many of these things, not all, much is produced by industry, but to make sure, as far as we can, that access to medicines, for example, and access to therapies is made as fair and as universal as possible. One of the other themes that we work on in my institute in Manchester, the Institute for Science, Ethics and Innovation, which is beloved of my friend and colleague John Sulston, is to try to change the intellectual and patent regime globally so that we can ensure access to medicines, that they're not priced beyond poor people, in particular in rich countries, and beyond very large populations in poor countries. But I think that's another endeavour. Sorry about the long answer to that very interesting and important question.
Rubén.
Just an declaration. Cloning per se is not to improve things.
That's right.
If you clone an idiot, you'll probably get an idiot.
That's right.
So you don't improve it, unless you want an idiot. All right.
Rubbish in, rubbish out.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, and I didn't mean to imply that there was any therapeutic or any other advantage in cloning per se. I just use as an example of a technology which has enabled a lot of panic and hatred to be stirred up unnecessarily against the scientific substrata of cloning, the sorts of things that will enable us to clone human beings, which are also useful, of course, for the development of therapies and so on. So we shouldn't worry about that. But yes, I didn't mean to imply that clones were superior to others. I'm not one half of... There's a wonderful book by an English comedian called Peter Cook, where the title of the book is "Alas, I am an only clone." I'm an only twin. Alas, I'm an only twin. Well, I'm not an only twin, so I have no interest in cloning.
Well,
if we consider cloning, and I want to ask you about the principle of precaution. Not precaution just as we shouldn't take any risks, because that is, as you say, ridiculous. But precaution, rightly understood, is, as a legal principle, if there is some evidence of grave danger, then society should prohibit or could take measures to prohibit something, an action, until the action is considered safe. And that changes the burden of proof and puts the burden of proof on the people who propose the action rather than on the people who think the action should be illegal. So I want to ask, do you think the burden of proof for when we get to discussing the safety of cloning, do you think the burden of proof should be on the people who propose it to show that it is safe, or on the people who oppose it to show that there are too many dangers?
That's a very good question. I think, let me start by saying I think the burden of proof is the wrong way to think about the issue. I don't think it's an issue on which side the burden of proof lies. Not only because to talk of proof is misleading. Nothing is, if you have to prove something safe, you can never do that. So if the burden of proof is on somebody who wishes to introduce a technology or a therapy to prove that it's safe, it's impossible. You can't do it.
But just call it the balance of evidence.
Well, but then you have, I think the problem with precaution is that we mostly don't know in which direction precaution lies. So if we're talking about therapy, for example, we have, and whether we should introduce it, either into patients or indeed if it's a vaccine into a population, we have to try to decide whether more harm will be done by delaying its introduction than will be done by accelerating it. And often we just don't know the answer to that question. And I think it is misleading to pretend to the public that there is a mechanism, the precautionary principle, which helps us resolve those dilemmas. I just don't think it does. Because how dangerous, for example, does a vaccine have to be? A vaccine that will prevent a deadly illness before it's worth introducing. Very difficult calculation to make. The other thing is, of course, we don't know about late onset problems. So all you know is you do it in mice and it doesn't kill too many mice. You then go first into humans and it's reasonably successful, but you probably go into healthy adults and you don't know what the effect on children would be, but maybe you need to use it on children and so on. So I think it is misleading to think that there is this sort of this principle, which is always employed by responsible scientists and will protect us. I think there's no sensible way of formulating. I was looking at the formulation that you offered me. If there's evidence of great danger, well, there's unlikely to be evidence of great danger. What there is likely to be is absence of evidence of lack of danger. And then the question is, well, how likely is this X going to work? And what will be the level of good that it will do? Is it going to protect infants against mortality? What is it going to do? And how much of a risk is it worth taking to do that? And we will sometimes get that wrong. But I think what we have to do is to make the calculation in each case, and there are lots of variables. It might be just reckless not to introduce something. And because there are other cases where when we're talking about human experimentation, where there is a drug that looks pretty dangerous, but it might work. But the people it will benefit are going to die in a few weeks anyway. Why should they not have access to that, even though it hasn't had proper trials? And that's a very big issue, as you know, in medicine today. Should particular patient groups who are terminally ill have access to drugs that have not been properly trialed? But they'll all be dead before the trial is finished, so why not? I don't think precaution requires that we don't treat them because it hasn't gone through the sort of procedures that we would want it to go through if it was a foodstuff that you were going to put on a supermarket shelf. So we need to know, what is it, and you want to be very cautious about food that you put on supermarket shelf, but you may have good reasons to be less cautious about therapies that might help people who will have suffered from the delay. And I don't think there's an easy invocation of a principle to help us with that. We shouldn't be reckless, but what is recklessness? It depends on what's going to happen if and what's not going to happen if.
Sí, Arnoldo?
Yes, may you make a list of the main goals and the main risks of cloning?
Sorry?
Main goals and main risks of cloning.
Goals.
If you
Yes.
can make a list of the main goals and the main risks of cloning.
Well, I don't think there are huge scientific goals for human reproductive cloning. I think cloning embryos and cloning cells is already happening and is a vital tool in science. But you have to ask, so what are the risks? Well, the risks, but if you just think about human reproductive cloning, there are risks of any reproductive act that will create a new human. What are the chances of a disability or a disease being a result of this? What are the chances of short life expectancy? And are they worth it for the sake of this, of creating this individual? And are they worth it in order to enable this set of parents or this set of progenitors to reproduce in their methods of choice? Now, I've indicated that we already accept huge risks in reproduction. So I would say that the first set of risks about human reproductive cloning is they have to be worse than sexual reproduction for us to be too concerned about them. Because it's never going to be the method of choice for reasons that this judgment is going to be expensive. Sex is usually considered to be very cost effective and more fun than scientific intervention. So it's never going to replace sexual reproduction. But should we object to it, given the risks? Well, we can't learn much from Dolly because we just don't have enough. Sheep aren't the same as human beings, and we don't have enough data. But I think it's very likely that, as I said in a talk that I gave yesterday in another context, that using mouse models, we will have actually very good evidence about the safety of human cloning in a few years, because the more we learn, this was in the context of in vitro produced gametes, which have worked very successfully in mice and produce healthy offspring from both male and female mice. So I can't say more than that. But I think the salutary thing is it has to be more dangerous to be prevented than, at least than sexual reproduction. It's very unlikely that anybody would want to use it if it was more dangerous. But that's because people don't think about the dangers of sexual reproduction.
¿Alguien más? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Comentario? Thank you very much, John. Thank you guys.